Hi, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Molly.
And you're listening to the Two Sisters on Adventures podcast, the Copper Ridge Loop, Day 2. So this is where the going gets tough, I would say. And the tough got going.
Indeed.
Anyways, this was kind of funny because I remember we woke up and we were so excited to start the day with just a nice, easy ridge walk. You know, we were just going to walk and there would be no uphill, no downhill. We would just admire the views. And we found out that we were completely delusional.
And we knew the forecast for this day was still supposed to be hot. We knew we were going to be on a ridge, so it would be exposed. And so we wanted to get started somewhat early because, first of all, we wanted to be on the ridge before the heat of the day. And second of all, we had the crossings of Indian Creek and the Chilliwack River. And those would be coming up just maybe a mile to 2 miles prior to our campsite. So we knew that the earlier you could cross those rivers, the more successful you'd be, just because you wouldn't have to deal with the water being quite so high. I think we'd heard or read some reviews, you know, that later in the afternoon people were talking about it being thigh deep. But like in the morning, some people could find areas where it braided out and crossed like ankle deep water. So we knew that we wanted to try to get to that crossing as quickly as we could. So we had another late start to be successful there.
Yep. And I mean, it's hard to get started when it's so beautiful around you, though, because I think the mosquitoes, for whatever reason, had kind of chilled out in the morning. So we were just like, look at all the beautiful views. And I do remember once we got started, everywhere you looked, and this is why I would say the Copper Ridge portion of this trail would be worth doing, even if you can't do the whole loop. It is like the Alps out there. It is amazing. I mean, you are on a ridge, and on either side is glacially carved valleys with mountains that still have glaciers on them. There's a river down below. I mean, everything just looks so awesome every direction you turn. Like every video we have from this day, I'm going, wow, that's pretty incredible that we have that in the United States of America.
Yeah.
You don't have to go to Europe for that.
Yeah.
And so that definitely kind of made it a little bit of an easier day on the ridge. However, we were going back and looking at some of the stats for this day on trail for us. And so at first we got to go downhill a little bit. Unfortunately, because we were able to collect some of the water from the snowmelt by our campsite, we didn't have to go all the way down to Egg Lake and add in that mileage and elevation.
And I would even say, just to begin with, that morning, I think we started around like 8:30 or 9 a.m. It already felt hot. Like up on the ridge, the sun was strong and it already felt warm, just like at the very beginning, just getting up from our tents.
So fortunately, we didn't have to go and add that mileage to Egg Lake on, and it was a huge deal for us, honestly, because I think that would have added at least a mile and maybe a 500 or so feet of gain to our morning. So at first we got to go downhill, and we're kind of like, yeah, the downhill, the flat ridge walk, I can't wait. Even though up ahead you look and you see the ridge is not flat, I feel like I still in my heart was like, no, that can't be what's gonna happen.
And you can even see the lookout about a mile away, and it's much higher than you are, which granted, when we were at Silesia camp, it's like you're fairly high too, so the lookout doesn't look quite so high. But then when you descend, we actually just looked at the map, and it was going to be about a mile and 1,000 feet of ascent up to the Copper Ridge lookout. So that actually, it adds up, and the trail itself is challenging, right? It's a wild area, and the trail is not this just like pure flat even grade. It's these switchbacks, it's brush, it's fairly steep sections with loose rock. And then Carrie mentioned the river down below. It was really cool. There was this one switchback where we were on the end of it, and it was just this very steep, basically cliff that we were on, and you could look down and peer and like see the river running wildly below, and you could actually hear it. And I remember thinking like, wow, we're really high up, but you can still hear the river roaring below. And it was just, yeah, it was amazing. Another really cool thing is just because the snow had recently melted, everything was just as green as you can imagine in the areas where there were grass and not snowdrifts. And so just having the contrast of the green grassy slopes with those mountains in the distance, literally all around us, like Carrie mentioned, was absolutely amazing.
And so then we actually made it up to the lookout, and that's pretty cool. We were not able to go inside it because, it was locked. But we did get to kind of look at it, and it was kind of a neat area. And actually, I think that later when we'd meet up with Dan, the guy we met on the first day, he had been supposed to camp at Copper Lake, but he got so late on his itinerary, and it was just so much more difficult than he thought, that I think he said he just slept on the porch of the Lookout, which you're not really supposed to do. But I mean, also, if it's after sundown and you're there, I don't really know what you're supposed to do otherwise. Totally. So once we got there, we were kind of like, okay, now we will descend and only descend, and it will be super pleasant, right? So,
and the next section, so we had to stop at the Lookout for a while and just take pictures because the view is just amazing. And from the Lookout, you kind of round on the ridge, and then you lose a couple of the views from behind you because you start to drop down, and now you see the ridge behind you. But at that point of the Lookout, I remember it seemed from any angle, it was just amazing. And we took these pictures where behind us is just the valley, and just the contrast and the elevation is just amazing, and you'll have to take a peek at the pictures we post because it was just truly incredible. And so it was interesting because we got to the Lookout, and then after that was just this massive snowfield. So we actually traversed across a snowfield for maybe a quarter of a mile or more, and I remember that being a pretty fun section of the hike.
The only negative I'd say is then we started thinking like, oh shoot, if there's a snowfield here, then why didn't we bring our ice axes? It's probably going to be snow all the way down, a teeny little bit of spiral, but I think that we were able to readjust and just be like, well, okay. I mean, how hot it is, maybe there'll be no snow by an hour from now. Just kidding. So anyway, once we got down from there, we eventually made our way to Copper Lake, which I will say, oh my goodness, we didn't get to spend hardly any time there because this is just a long day and a busy day, and we had a lot of things we needed to do, which we did refill our water there, and I'm super glad because that was like the last water until we got down to the Chilliwack River. Well,
and I think
other than a little waterfall.
And I think I was actually, so, you know, when we are hiking, we're monitoring, like we track everything on our watches, and some people will stop their watch every time, you know, they stop for a rest break or whatever, but we just let the watches run. So when we're talking about our like pace, it's our pace including all rest breaks, and even like increased time like to cross hazards or obstacles. So at this point, when we got to Copper Lake, I mean, it was just under a 12-mile day, so we felt like that was very doable for us. But when we got to Copper Lake, it was 3.5 miles that we'd hiked, and it was about 3 hours. And so I think that has to do with just because the trail is not flat, it is challenging, and it requires time and navigation. It was hot. And so I think we were kind of, you know, trying to figure out like where we'd take our rest break and how we're going to still get to the river to try to cross it before it's at its full height for the day, full depth for the day. And so we just really couldn't enjoy our time at Copper Lake. But I think my favorite view of Copper Lake is actually when we were descending down to it, because it has that deep blue color. I think of, is it called Mica Lake in the Glacier Peak Wilderness? And I think of even places like Crater Lake in Oregon that have just this beautiful blue color. And that's really what Copper Lake looks like, especially when you're descending towards it.
So I really don't think we took much of a break at Copper Lake. I think we basically had a bar while we filtered water, and we were just being super efficient. And honestly, every single time we filtered water this day, we had just almost ran out. So we went 3 miles. It took us 3 hours, and we drank 3 liters, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. I mean, sometimes we might go a whole day and drink 3 liters, you know? So when it's hot out, I don't think I would recommend like the 2 smart water bottle method, just because you really want to be able to keep yourself hydrated, and that's 2 liters versus 3 liters in your pack. So we refilled our water there, and then we got right back on trail, and this was where we kind of met with one of our bigger trail hazards for the day, or so we thought.
So we were walking along, and we were ready to finally make good time after we had stopped to fill up our water at Copper Lake. And I remember we kind of rounded a corner, and we just heard this just rushing water sound. And we didn't even know that there was any other water on the ridge, kind of, because I think it just depends on snow melt. And it makes sense that there was water in this creek area because of the amount of snow that was still melting, but it wasn't necessarily on our radar. So we get close to the area, and it is just wild. There's like a waterfall up above, and then where the trail crosses is like a pinch point, and it is just fire hosing across. Like, I want to say that the water was probably like 2 feet deep or more. Like, actually, we never really even got close enough to test it with the poles, but it was just fire hosing through.
One thing I will say that I kind of regret is I did not get a video up close of what that crossing actually looked like, because I feel like it doesn't sound that bad, except for if you saw it, because it was too far for you to like jump across reliably. But it was, just this narrow pinch point. The water was shooting across. It was fairly deep. And then, of course, the run out is immediately straight downhill to the side. So I think we kind of looked at it for a second and we were like, you know what? That is just not worth it to us, because it wasn't going to be just one step. It was going to be several steps across, and the rock was very slick looking. So we said, okay, time to kind of bang around and find something better.
And so I was looking, at first I tried to go upstream a little, but you really were limited in how far upstream you could go because it really was a waterfall above. And so I went up a little ways and it felt like, like the other shore was close, but you would have to take at least 2 steps in just the fire hose of water. And so I was just like, I just don't see that being a feasible option for us. And so it was kind of wild because we were stumped for a minute on what we were even supposed to do, because below where it was crossing the trail, it like kept descending in like miniature waterfalls where it would be like 2 or 3 feet of drop, and then it would level out and then drop again. And directly below the trail was like this grassy area, and there were just like streams of water, and it was deep. Like, if you know those subalpine environments, it's weird because you'll get this channel of water and then you'll put your pole in it and it's like 3 feet deep, and this is the kind of channels there were. And then the grass you could see was like really saturated and muddy, and so you're like, oh gosh, like if I'm walking through there, am I just gonna like sink or like slip into a hole that I don't even know exists? And so I feel like this area, I don't even know if I read anything about something like this on any of the trail reviews, and it really was a time where we had to kind of like stop and discuss what we were going to do and really take a hard look at it. And once again, it was tough because following it upstream was not possible because it was like a cliff. Downstream just looked weird because it braided out so differently, and it was also on the slope of a hillside.
So basically, we finally decided we're going to go downstream, because even if there is that 4-foot deep water, the current's definitely slower. It's not an immediate drop off. And I mean, it just didn't look as bad. So we made our way down the slope very much one at a time, kind of testing the ground ahead of us with our poles to see if it was just going to be like a sudden way sinking in. And it was all pretty sturdy. So I think Molly went first, and you kind of stepped across like the first channel of water, and it looked like everything was going well. So I followed, and so did Rachel. And then there was like this kind of weird little thing where you had to kind of almost leap to the next rock, but it was completely dry, which was, I think, why we selected that rock, because it was not slippery and it wasn't at a crazy angle, and you had to walk up the rock a little bit and then basically like kind of take a big step or pull yourself over to the other shore, you'd say.
Yeah, and it was weird because once we like stepped off the trail and then crossed like the first little channel, then we were like walking through the just saturated grass areas and these like little channels of water that weren't running too hard. But then, like Carrie's describing, we were on this dry rock, and it was like a channel of the stream that was flowing pretty hard and looked to be, a couple feet deep, like you wouldn't really want to fall in it. And the run out is like basically it just kind of keeps going downhill, dropping a couple feet at a time and then running through rocks. So this one area Carrie's describing, it's basically to get to the middle of the stream before then you'd have to cross the rest of the stream. And so basically what we had to do is, I think we just put our poles in the creek, and then we could have maybe tried stepping in the water. I wasn't interested in that at the time. So I just took this big step across onto the next rock, and then there was nothing to hold on to, and we had to do another step to another rock. And then we did end up wading through several inches of water and kind of a pool to get to the other side. But it was one of those things, I'll have to look, but I want to say it took us probably 30 minutes to just like stop and problem solve our route. And Carrie and I, we have long legs, and so that was an advantage for us. When Rachel had to step across the channel, she was like max extension to get there, and she did do it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it was kind of like a little stressful when Rachel was in there, which, first of all, when you got to that rock that was in the middle, it was like kind of nerve-wracking because it was so loud with like the water shooting around you on either side. And so we were kind of watching Rachel, and I think her backpack actually kind of tipped her back a little bit. So then we're like, oh no, grab to the rock, Rachel. And she's just very strong, so she was able to do that. And I can't remember if we even put a hand out to help her across, because she unfortunately has those legs that are shorter than ours, which again, she's actually pretty tall, but she's not like 5'10", 5'11". So that is kind of a disadvantage on that trail. But once we made it across the waterfall, we were like, now we've made it through one of the hardest parts of the day. Again.
And it was one of those things, just like Hell's Gorge the day before, where we looked at that and I was like, you know what? That is just going to be getting worse as the day goes on, as more snow melts. Mm-hmm. So this is another reason why there is no way I'm turning around. We're going to continue doing this loop in the direction that we're going, because I am not crossing that again. Carrie, do you feel like with the additional, experience we've had on trail since we did this Copper Ridge Loop in August of 2022, do you feel like you would be as intimidated by that crossing as you were that day?
I honestly don't think so. And I kind of wonder if we would have been okay to make our way across the original crossing point. I mean, it's just so hard. It was running so fast. I feel like we stuck our poles in it a couple times and they just like would shoot out. Yeah. So I don't know, because it's like, is it just the distance of time where I'm thinking it's not as bad as I thought? Or is it actually not as bad as I thought it was? I feel like sometimes we just go, oh, that wasn't actually so bad. But yeah, I don't think it would intimidate me as much as it did then. And that's why, again, this was such a great trip for us, because there were so many things that were really intimidating at the time. And I think that this was such a empowering trip, because after we got back, we'd be like, we'd come to these challenges, we'd think it through, we'd problem solve together. Everyone on the team was on board, and then we'd go and we'd do them, and it was awesome.
And every time it was this adrenaline rush. Like, there are so many instances in this, 5-day period where the adrenaline, the heart rate spiked. You're like kind of in survival mode, just figuring out what you're going to do. And then when you've crossed the challenge, it was just like a very relieving and exciting feeling to say like, oh, we did it.
Also, it was really funny because people afterwards were like, why didn't you take a picture of this or that? Like, you didn't take a picture of this crossing or that crossing or this snowfield. And I'm like, we were so in the moment, and that's still how we exist, where it's like we often miss the cool hazard pictures because we're so busy, like focusing on our teammate, like giving them a little tip here and there, like, oh, I did this here, I did that here, and focusing on our own crossing, that I feel like we always miss out on those really cool shots. Sorry, guys. So after we took our rest break, it was onward and forward, and we knew that we had like one of those bigger hazards or things that we were concerned about left through the day, which was that snowfield that Molly had been nervous about and thinking we might need an ice axe for. So as we made our way, eventually it's like, I feel like you kind of round a corner and there it is ahead of you, the crossing, which in a way is just always frustrating, because it's like, look, another thing that we have to problem solve and think about and decide how we're going to cross. But also that's kind of the decision we took when we came on this trail. So I think that we could see that there was a crossing spot right where the trail was, and we definitely went and checked that out first, but we felt really uncomfortable with it because it looked like the steps weren't firmly kicked in, and I don't know, maybe about 200 feet below there was the run out with a bunch of rocks. And so I think that we kind of made a decision that we would continue down the trail, because the trail actually goes down there. It switchbacks down. We were like, well, you know what, worst case scenario, we'll go down, and then if we don't like it, we'll just come back up. And when we switch back to the bottom of the trails, it's like at least you're already starting out by the rocks. So if you fall right away, you're only going to fall maybe like 15 feet and hit a rock versus like 150. So we decided that we were going to start there. And I think it was a little awkward to get on because there was a little bit of a moat. So we kind of had to problem solve, where should we step on? And so Molly went first. We put on our micro spikes, which I think were perfect for that time of day because it wasn't totally icy, and yet it wasn't completely slushy.
And I wanted to say too that, I mean, just approaching this snow slope, it's interesting because most of the ridge, you're on top of it, but then as you're descending it, there's this one kind of curve in the ridge which leads to a very steep slope that is north facing. And so there is just snow all along it. And so it's like Carrie mentioned, the snow slope was there. And where the trail was initially going to cross, if you were to slide or slip, you'd slide quite a ways before you get to the rocks. But where we were going to step on to the snow kind of slope, there was still like maybe the initial step on, you might slide 15 feet, but you could still probably slide another 100 feet down, which was still something that ended in rocks. And once again, it was wild because there were a couple big rocks in the snowfield close to where we were going to step on, and you could see that there was a moat around each rock where we couldn't even see the bottom, but all you could see was that the snow was pulled away from the rock and that there was a hole there. So so we put on the micro spikes, and it was just, I don't know, like it just felt kind of scary. And so one of those things where, you stepped on the snow and you thought, well, now that I'm on here, I just have to keep moving because I don't want to stand in between these two rocks where there's obvious holes in the snow for too long. So
I will say Molly was good about kicking her steps in, right? So she would take kind of the edge of her micro spikes in the front of her foot and kick her foot in to get a good foothold. And then the nice thing is, me coming after her, I could also put my foot in that foothold, but also give it a kick to give it a better step for Rachel. So it's like we were kind of creating our own steps, because it looked like people had mostly crossed the top portion, which was fine, I guess, for them. But for us, it was nice because we kicked those steps up, and it was like up and over versus just having to go straight across, which I feel was a way that was more comfortable for us at the time.
And also at this point, one thing would be Ranger Shelvin had told us about, when you are descending in the snow slope, to make sure you're really digging your heels into the snow as you go. So then you're creating almost a step for you to descend as well. So we didn't have to use that too much on this instance because we were kind of going up and then traversing across. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is there was a lot of, I don't know if you could consider them sun cups at that point, but the snow was faceted by how the sun had, melted it. And so that almost turned into like little steps for us as well, so we could kind of use those just features that already existed. If once I started going, I wasn't going to be looking back to see how everyone behind me was doing. I just had to focus on the present and what I was going to do and kind of control those variables. And so the first half of the traverse was kind of fine because we were going up in a sense, and then we traversed kind of parallel to the slope, and then we descended just a little bit to get back to where it hit the trail. And I remember that part, there were a couple steps where the snow was like, it wasn't icy, it wasn't totally slushy where you could kick in and like get like several inches of footing. It was just like the middle, like kind of in between. And so I do remember there were a couple steps where it did feel like a little slippery, and one time I allowed myself to kind of look down and see what the slope looked like, and that didn't feel fun to me. So I just kept focusing on one step at a time, making sure that, like, maybe we haven't talked about this, but when you're in that type of an environment, making sure that I had both poles and one foot down before I took another step. So I had 3 points of contact, and continued until it felt like forever, but I finally did reach the other side.
And it's funny because we do have like 1 3-second video from the very end of this as Rachel steps off, which is like the last person, because I feel like we finally felt safe enough, like we'll take a little quick video of this hazard that we just crossed. But honestly, even in that scenario, I feel like I just loved it because no one was panicking. And yes, we were behind schedule, but we all were like using all of our skills to find a good spot that everyone was comfortable with, and we were successful in it. So I think that's so important, the communication, the talking with your team, the making sure everyone's on the same page, and just trying to find a route that was best for all of us. And then we were like, now the hardest part of our day is over.
And once again, after we crossed that snow slope, I was like, another confirmation that I am 100% not turning around, because then I would have to not only cross the weird waterfall, but also the snow slope. So we are going to continue on our way.
And in addition to that, Hell's Gorge. So it was kind of funny because we just would laugh as like everything compiled itself to really say, well, we are in this now.
And just imagine some of us in the outdoors, like we like to get a bit of an adrenaline rush and feel empowered when we overcome an obstacle. And this day was just like never ending. Like we would kind of bring ourselves down from the high of, overcoming a challenge only to round a corner. And here's another challenge waiting for us. This maybe was one of the most intense days of hiking I've ever had.
Well, the funny thing is I think that, and then I think about tomorrow, and I'm like, ooh, I don't know. And honestly, there's still so much more to talk about from this day. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Two Sisters on Adventures podcast. We hope that you'll tune in next week to hear about the more major parts of our day than the waterfall and the snowfield, aka cross-country bushwhacking, how I got a permanent scar and where we met up with our best friend, Ranger Dan. Thanks so much for listening. And as always, you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Two Sisters on Adventures if you want to see any photos or videos of what we talked about today. And honestly, there's a lot of photos and videos from this day. So anyways, thanks so much. Bye.